Interviewees are one of the most important ingredients in a successful story, and yet one of the most common mistakes that people make when telling stories is not to spend enough time planning the interviews. There are three things to consider when it comes to planning your interviews. The first is being clear why you need interviewees in your story. What are the objectives? The second is to think about who is going to make the best interviewee for your story. And finally, you need to make sure that you have a range of types of interviewee to have a diverse range of expertise or experience in the story itself. And I'm going to talk about 4 particular categories to consider when you think about potential interviewees. Before we do that, I want you to pause this video and make a list of why you think interviewees are necessary for a story. If we don't know why we're doing this, why we're interviewing people, then it makes it a lot more difficult to identify who is going to be the best possible interviewee and what questions to ask them. So pause the video, make a list, why do we look for interviewees, and then resume. Okay, this is my list. At the top of my list is originality. This is probably the main reason why I would interview someone for a story. I need new information, I need original information. I need there to be a reason why someone is going to read my story or watch it or listen to it, and some original information in an interview is going to be the best way to do that. Secondly, I think we need interviewees for engagement, to engage an audience. That might be in terms of visuals or audio if our story is video or audio based. Even in a text story, quotes are going to break that story up and make it more engaging. But also there might be conflict, there might be other story elements that come from having someone being interviewed. Next, I've got verification and a right to reply. So quite often when you interview someone, you're putting some information to them from your background research, or if you've done data analysis, it might be from that. And actually interviewing someone is a good way to verify that what you've read or what you've found is true. If they say it's not true, then that doesn't mean it isn't true, but if they don't challenge it, then that does suggest that what you've found is more likely to be true. The right to reply is partly a legal consideration if you have a part of your story which might be critical or is raising concerns. In these situations, it's useful to offer a right of reply to someone who's being criticised in the story, partly because it makes your story more secure legally, but also partly because they might be able to clarify where responsibility lies, or indeed they might admit to the things being raised, the criticism, for example. A fourth consideration is optimization. Sometimes if you interview someone for a story, they're going to share your story with their followers, with their own networks, and that's going to extend the reach of your story. It also might lead to new story leads, new people getting in touch. So it's a more base consideration, but certainly social media optimization is on there. And then we have a diverse range of perspectives and experiences. This can be diverse in a number of different ways. One of the ways in which your interviewees might be diverse is the categories that I'm about to come on to. So having a range of expertise, people in power, people with personal experience, and so on, is actually one reason why you need interviews in your story. And the final reason listed there is particularly important. This is the role of non-verbal information in your story. Remember that what someone says is only part of the picture. How they say it, how they respond to a question, those non-verbal pieces of information can be really quite important to the story. So If you're putting some accusations to someone or some concerns, then how they respond to that is often just as important as what they say. Getting them on camera or being able to describe how they responded, getting them on audio, that's actually a really important reason to do an interview. And that list that we've just made can also become a list of objectives when it comes to choosing and conducting the interview. When we make a list of potential interviewees, we can pick certain names over others because we know that they're likely to give us more original information. We know that non-verbal information might be a key part of that interview, and so on. So just listing these qualities, these reasons for doing interviews, can help us identify which people are going to be best to interview and what questions we're going to be asking them. So let's pause the video again now and do that. I want you to take a story that you're working on or a story about graffiti and generate a list of ideas for interviewees. So who would you interview for that story? These can be specific names or they can just be types of people. Spend about 5 minutes making a list and then resume the video, and we're going to talk about ways to make that list better and ways to choose names from that list. Okay, we've now got a list of interview names or types of interviewees. Which ones on that list are going to be good ones? Who are the good interviewees? What makes a good interviewee? Well, now we get to the 4 categories that I mentioned earlier, and these are power, expertise, experience and representatives, what you might call peer for short. People in positions of power, they might be politically powerful, they might be financially powerful, they might be culturally powerful. So these are people who are famous or influential in some way. They might be legally powerful. In other words, they can arrest or take people to court. These are all forms of power, and these are likely to be important types of interviewee in our story because they have the power to do something about whatever it is that we're telling a story about. Then we have interviewees of expertise. That might be academics, it might be researchers, but it might be people who are successful in a particular field and have expertise through that. We want people with experience, people who have experienced something firsthand or might have witnessed a particular event in our story. And we want representatives. These are individuals who represent a group of people. It might be a union representative, for example, who represents a group of employers. It might be a charity representative who represents people who have a particular medical condition, for example, or who have had particular experiences as well. And we're looking for these people to be clear and engaging. Some examples of those categories flesh this out a bit further. So the obvious example of someone with political power is a politician. A chief executive of a company is someone who has financial power. In terms of expertise, I mentioned researchers. It's worth highlighting that charities often have researchers who are experts. Authors of books are another useful source of expert interviews. When it comes to representatives, I've mentioned unions and charities. Lawyers might represent a collection of clients, for example. Agents might represent a collection of sports people. Editors might represent readers of a particular publication. And it's worth highlighting here that politician appears again here because politicians represent the people who voted for them and even the people who didn't vote for them, the people who live in their constituency or their local authority or whatever area it is that they represent. So we have here a politician that might be a representative of their local community, but they might also be someone in a position of power. And that highlights how important it is to decide what category of interviewee you're looking for, because interviewing a politician as a result of the laws that they've passed or are proposing is very different to interviewing a politician because they represent their local community. Once you've decided which it is, it makes it much easier to decide the questions that you're going to ask. Each of these types of categories of interviewee also tends to play different roles in a story. For example, taking action is a common event in a story, and this is something that people in power often do, and so that's often the role that they play in a story. They take action at some point in the story. Experts and people with experience don't tend to do this. They tend to play more of a role of providing context or colour to those actions. So the expert might provide some background to an issue that the politician has taken action on. We might have a case study of someone affected by that issue, affected by the decisions taken by people in power. Then we have reaction in a story. So there is some criticism or concern, and then we seek some reaction to that. Again, this is more likely to be people in power or representatives, unions, charities, and so on. And finally, we have a reply stage in a story where there might be reply to criticisms or concerns. And again, this is probably most likely to be someone in a position of power doing that. So knowing these categories and knowing this information, it's worth looking at stories and asking, why did they speak to the people that they spoke to in that story? What role did each interview that they conducted play? Where did it appear in the story? Where were the quotes? Where were the clips used? Why were they used in those positions? You can try to think about what questions were probably asked of the person that was interviewed. And again, why were those questions asked? Remember that all the stories you see could always have been done better. Every person who tells a story always feels that they could have done it better. And so you should be asking those questions as well. What other interviewees could they have spoken to? What different questions or extra questions could they have asked? What questions do you feel are unanswered in the story? This process is really useful to do with all stories because it helps you look at your own storytelling more critically as well and tell better stories. One story you can look at is Athlete A. This is a documentary about abuse in the United States gymnastics team. And you'll see in this story that they interview people across those categories that I have detailed. There are people in positions of power, there are people with expertise, there are people who represent those involved and affected. There are people who witnessed events and were affected by them directly. So watch this and have a think about where those people appear in the story and how that diversity of types of interviewee really brings a richness and variety to the story and keeps it engaging. Another example is a feature story from The Guardian called The Best £20 That You'll Ever Spend, and it's based on interviews entirely with experts. So in this case we've not got a diversity of categories of interviewee. All of the interviewees are experts, but actually there's quite a wide range of types of experts. And writing about the story, the writer talks about how she identified experts, and it's a good example of the different types of expertise that we're talking about. So we have someone who's an editor at a magazine who has expertise because of that. We have an author, we have an Olympic champion. So these are all very different types of expertise. We have people who have founded businesses. We have a successful designer. So again, this just gives you an idea of how expertise can really vary. So again, something you can do now is to pause this video and look at that list of ideas for interviewees that you made earlier. Specifically, what you should do is identify gaps based on the categories that we've identified. So are there any experts in your list? What types of experts are they? Can you add more experts and a wider range of types of experts using some of the examples that I've given? So, for example, experts because of success, experts who are authors, experts who are academics, experts who are researchers for charities. Do you have case studies, people with some sort of experience in your list of interviewees? What types of case studies could you include? What types of power are represented in your list? Is it just political power? Do you have legal power, cultural power? Are there interviewees who have other types of power in your list as well? And what about representatives? What groups are involved in your story? Not just the people who are affected by the story, but anyone who's involved in the system that the story touches on. Who represents those people, those groups? And are they in your list? Spend about 10 minutes reviewing your list and trying to fill those gaps once you've identified them. Okay, a couple of technical points when it comes to referencing the material that we've covered in these slides. First of all, the framework of categories that I've outlined here, so representatives, expertise, experience and power, that peer framework, that's detailed in a blog post called Here's a Framework to Help Fill the Human Gap in Your Story. The full reference for that is at the bottom there, and you would reference it in the way shown on screen. Likewise, if you're using this to brainstorm ideas, it's a really good idea to document that, keep a record of your brainstorming and include that as evidence in an appendix with your assignment. So that might be Appendix B, for example, here, and that's how you would reference it in your assignment. Some key takeaways then as we come to an end. Firstly, remember that there are objectives here. There are reasons why we need interviewees. If you're clear about what those objectives are, then that will make it much easier to choose interviewees and to plan the interview. So do be clear what your objectives are. Secondly, think about those 4 categories of interviewee, and as you start to make a list of potential interviewees, check that you're coming up with names for each of these categories. You have powerful people, you have people with expertise, you have people with experience, and you have representatives. Finally, once you've done that, you can start to think about the role that each of those interviewee plays in your story. Are you talking to them about the actions that they took? Are you talking about colour and context to the events in your story? Are you asking them about reaction or replies to concerns or criticisms? Use that to guide the questions that you're asking and where those interviewees are likely to be used in your story.